The air in my mother's living room was thick and cloying, a heavy cocktail of wilting lilies and lemon polish. It was the scent of a house that had already become a museum to a life just ended. Mr. Abernathy, the family lawyer for what felt like 100 years, sat in my father's wingback chair, his worn leather briefcase gaping open at his feet. His face, a roadmap of bored professionalism, showed no emotion as he cleared his throat. The silence that followed was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the very breath from my lungs. My father sat ramrod straight on the sofa, a statue of stoicism, while my brother Daniel next to him shifted his weight, the fabric of his new suit rustling with anticipation. I felt like an intruder, perched on the edge of a stiff armchair my mother had always called the guest chair. Even now, I was a guest. Mr. Abernathy began to read from the thick vellum paper, his voice a monotonous drone that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. I, Eleanor May Covington, being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament. The legal jargon washed over me, a tide of meaningless words. I was watching a fly buzz against the window pane, a tiny, frantic speck of life in a room suffocated by death and decorum. Then, a single phrase cut through the haze, sharp and lethal as a shard of glass. I bequeath the entirety of my estate, including the family home located at 1288 Sycamore Lane, all financial accounts, stocks, bonds, and personal effects, to my beloved son, Daniel Covington. The drone continued, but I heard nothing else. He had said entirety. He had said son. He had said Daniel. When the lawyer finally read the first lines of the will, I only heard my brother's name. My name wasn't there. In that moment, it felt like I was that little girl again, the one my parents never noticed. The girl with the scraped knees and straight A report cards that were always met with a distracted nod, because Daniel had just learned to ride his bike without training wheels, or had scored the winning goal. A hot wave of shame washed over me, so intense it felt like a physical fever. I could feel the eyes of my aunts and cousins, their gazes a mixture of pity and a strange, morbid satisfaction. The air crackled with their unspoken thoughts, the final confirmation of what they had all whispered for years. It was always going to be Daniel. I was just the placeholder, the shadow that made him seem brighter. I dared a glance at him. He wasn't smirking, not yet. He was better than that. Instead, he wore a mask of solemn duty, his head bowed slightly as if accepting a heavy but necessary burden. But I saw it. I saw the subtle tightening around his eyes, the almost imperceptible upward twitch at the corner of his mouth. It was the same look he'd had at age 10 when he'd convinced our parents I was the one who broke the antique vase. He was the golden child, the heir apparent, and this document, this final word from our mother, was merely the coronation he had been waiting for his entire life. My father stared blankly at the Persian rug, his expression as unreadable as it had always been. His silence was a form of consent, a quiet affirmation of the family's unwritten constitution. He had never intervened before. Why would he start now? Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat again, a dry, papery sound. "To my daughter, Sarah," he said, and my heart gave a pathetic little lurch. Hope is a stubborn, foolish thing. I leave my mother's antique garnet ring, in the hopes that she will wear it and remember the strength of the women in our family. A ring. One old ring. The finality of it was a slap in the face. It wasn't an oversight, it was a statement. He closed the folder with a soft click that sounded like a coffin lid shutting. The room was still for a beat, and then the murmuring began, the quiet rustle of relatives shifting in their seats, ready to perform the next act of this family drama. They would offer me their condolences, their hands cool and brief on my arm, their eyes filled with a pity I didn't want. But underneath the shock and the searing humiliation, something else was stirring. A cold, hard knot of disbelief. It simply didn't make sense. Just 2 months ago, sitting in this very room, my mother had taken my hand. Her grip was frail, her skin like tissue paper, but her eyes were clear. "I've taken care of everything, Sarah," she'd whispered, her voice raspy. "You won't have to worry. You've always been the strong one, but even the strong ones deserve a soft place to land." How could those words lead to this? How could that promise, that moment of rare, startling intimacy, result in my complete and utter erasure? I looked from the lawyer's impassive face to my brother's carefully constructed grief, and for the first time in my life, the quiet sadness I had carried began to curdle into a different shape. It was sharp, it was cold, and it felt a lot like rage. I didn't get the house, or the money, or the lifetime of memories contained in these walls. I got a single question mark, hanging in the suffocating air of my mother's perfect living room. Why? The weight of the garnet ring on my finger was surprisingly heavy, its deep red stone cool against my skin. It felt less like a memento and more like a stone from a graveyard. Mr. Abernathy's words echoed, but they were drowned out by a memory that rushed back with the force of a tidal wave, smelling of vinegar and wet cardboard. I was 10 years old, standing in the noisy, cavernous school gymnasium for the annual science fair in the spring of 1998. For 2 solid weeks, I had meticulously built a model of the solar system. I'd used styrofoam balls, painted with an almost obsessive attention to detail, the swirling red spot on Jupiter, the pale blue of Neptune, the delicate rings of Saturn crafted from my mother's old sewing hoops and glitter. It was my universe, a perfect, ordered cosmos spinning on wire orbits around a glowing yellow sun. My project stood on one side of our designated family table. On the other side was Daniel's contribution, a lumpy papier-mâché volcano painted a garish brown with angry streaks of red lava dripping from its crater. He had built it in a single afternoon, with my father's enthusiastic help. It was a classic, the kind of project that was all flash and no substance. But Daniel, even at 12, understood the power of a spectacle. He was the center of his own solar system, and our parents were just planets held in his gravitational pull. My father clapped him on the shoulder, his voice booming with pride. "That's my boy. Ready to make this thing blow?" My mother stood by with her camera, her smile so wide it seemed to eclipse everything else in the room. They loved Daniel with a loud, declarative love. It was a public performance, a testament to their success in raising a son who was confident, charming, and destined for greatness. My father saw a future CEO, a leader of men. My mother saw the continuation of the Covington name, a legacy secured. My achievements were quiet, internal things, a perfect score on a math test, a poem published in the school's literary journal. They were acknowledged with a brief, "That's nice, honey," before the conversation inevitably shifted back to Daniel's latest triumph on the soccer field or his lead role in the school play. My successes were footnotes in the grand, unfolding epic of my brother's life. I was the responsible one, the steady one, the one who never caused any trouble. I was a fixed point, a dependable background star, which allowed them to focus all their light on their brilliant, blazing sun. The moment came for the demonstration. Daniel poured a generous amount of baking soda into his volcano, followed by a slosh of vinegar dyed red with food coloring. The foam erupted with a satisfying hiss, spilling over the sides and onto the plastic tablecloth. A small crowd of parents and kids gathered, oohing and aahing at the cheap, predictable theatrics. My mother's camera flashed relentlessly, capturing the moment of glory. "Oh, Daniel, it's magnificent!" she exclaimed, beaming. "Just like a real volcano!" My father stood with his arms crossed, a king surveying his domain, his heir having just proven his worth. Amid the applause, I saw my father lean in and whisper something to Daniel, who then puffed out his chest with an extra dose of self-importance. They were a team, a closed circle. Then, my mother, as if suddenly remembering she had another child, turned to me. She glanced at my painstakingly crafted solar system. "Oh, Sarah, yours is very neat," she said. The word hung in the air, a synonym for boring, for uninspired. My father came over, his attention already drifting. "Good work," he mumbled, giving Saturn's rings a careless flick with his finger, nearly dislodging them. "Did you see the look on everyone's face when Danny's volcano blew? That's my boy. He knows how to put on a show." And then they were gone, following Daniel as he soaked up the congratulations. I stood alone by my silent, orderly universe, the smell of vinegar burning my nostrils. It was in that moment, in the echoing gymnasium, that the feeling first crystallized inside me. It wasn't just disappointment. It was the cold, hard certainty of injustice. It was the understanding that no amount of effort or perfection on my part would ever be enough to compete with the simple, dazzling fact of my brother's existence. The funeral, just 3 days prior, had been a masterclass in choreographed grief. We stood in the receiving line at the front of the chapel, a receiving line that felt a mile long. The air was heavy with the scent of lilies and damp wool coats, a smell I now associate with polite public sorrow. My father stood like a stone sentinel at the head of the line, his face a mask of grim duty. Beside him, Daniel. He had become the day's tragic protagonist, the young prince who had lost his queen. He accepted handshakes and tearful hugs with a practiced solemnity, his voice a low, comforting murmur as he thanked people for coming. He was a natural, effortlessly commanding the sympathy and attention of every guest who shuffled past. I was the third person in line, the silent bookend. My role, I quickly discovered, was to be an afterthought. The mourners would spend a full minute with my father, clasping his hand, and then move to Daniel, their voices dropping to hushed, intimate tones. They'd embrace him, pat his back, and offer heartfelt condolences for his loss. When they finally reached me, their momentum was already carrying them away. I received a quick, cool touch on the arm, a fleeting glance of pity, and a mumbled, "So sorry for your loss," before their eyes were already scanning the pews for a seat. I was a procedural step, a box to be checked on the way to the main event. It was a role I had been rehearsing my entire life. My great-aunt Carol, a woman whose face was a permanent rictus of disapproval, paused in front of me, her grip on my elbow surprisingly strong. "You must be strong for your father and brother now, Sarah," she whispered, her breath smelling of mints and mothballs. "They are going to need you more than ever." Her words were meant to be kind, I suppose, but they landed like a confirmation of my status. I was not one of the primary mourners. I was staff. My grief was secondary, a resource to be used in service of the men whose loss was deemed more profound, more significant. I just nodded, the gesture feeling hollow and disconnected from the storm of emotions brewing inside me. I wanted to scream that I needed someone to be strong for me too. During the eulogy, which Daniel delivered with a voice that trembled in all the right places, I felt a profound sense of dislocation, as if I were watching a play about a family I'd only read about. He spoke of our mother's boundless love for him, her pride in his accomplishments, her unwavering belief in his future. He told a charming anecdote about how she'd helped him build a Pinewood Derby car, staying up until 2 in the morning to get the weights just right. The congregation chuckled softly, dabbing at their eyes. He mentioned me once. "And Sarah, of course," he said, with a brief, dismissive glance in my direction. "Mom was always proud of how self-sufficient you were." He made it sound like a compliment, but I heard the truth beneath it. I was the one who didn't need anything, the one it was safe to ignore. After the service, as we stood by the graveside under a sky the color of slate, the performance reached its crescendo. The minister said his final words, and the first handful of dirt struck the polished wood of the casket with a sickening thud. My father, who had not shed a single tear, finally showed a flicker of emotion. He reached out, not to me, but to Daniel, placing a heavy, possessive hand on his shoulder. He squeezed it, a silent, powerful gesture of solidarity. It was a tableau of male grief, of lineage, of the torch being passed. I stood a few feet away, outside of that circle of touch and meaning, wrapped in a cold that had nothing to do with the November air. I was present, but I was not included. I was a witness to my family's story, but never a part of it. The drone of Mr. Abernathy's voice faded, but the words he'd spoken hung in the air, thick and poisonous. To my daughter, Sarah, I leave my mother's antique garnet ring. He continued, his voice picking up a slightly more compassionate, almost apologetic tone, as if this small addendum was a personal kindness on his part. In the hopes that she will wear it and remember the strength of the women in our family. The strength. He might as well have said, in the hopes that she will continue to endure being screwed over. The lawyer slowly, deliberately, placed the document back into a manila folder. He slid a small, velvet-covered box across the polished surface of the coffee table. It stopped just short of my knee. The silence in the room was a physical weight, pressing down on my chest and making it hard to breathe. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My entire world had narrowed to that small, dark red box. It was an exclamation point at the end of a life sentence. A wave of heat rushed up my neck and flooded my face, a blush so intense it felt like my skin was on fire. This wasn't just a financial disinheritance, it was a public declaration. It was my mother's final posthumous announcement to everyone who mattered in our small world that I, Sarah, was worth nothing more than a piece of antique jewelry. A token. A consolation prize for a race I never even knew I was running. I could feel the collective gaze of my aunts and cousins, their eyes boring into me. It was a humiliating, soul-stripping shame, the kind that makes you want to shrink into nothingness. Then, the shame began to curdle, transmuting into something else, something hot and sharp. Rage, a pure, crystalline rage that burned away the fog of shock. I lifted my head and looked at my brother. Daniel had his head bowed, the very picture of humble, sorrowful acceptance. But I knew him. I knew the subtle tension in his jaw, the way he held his shoulders. He was not grieving, he was reigning. He was absorbing his victory, savoring the moment the crown was officially placed upon his head. He had won. He had always won. And this will was not a surprise to him. I saw it in the practiced stillness of his body, the careful control of his expression. He knew. He had known all along. My father finally stirred. He didn't look at me. He couldn't. Instead, he stared out the large bay window at the perfectly manicured lawn, the lawn I had helped my mother tend every summer for 20 years. His silence was the most damning indictment of all. It was his consent, his co-signature on my erasure. He had always been a passive king, allowing my mother to manage the emotional and social politics of the family, but his passivity was a choice. It was an action. By saying nothing, he was saying everything. This is the natural order of things. This is correct. The family's assets, its legacy, were being consolidated, passed down the proper line, from man to man, with my mother acting as the temporary custodian. I was just a detour, a secondary clause. Mr. Abernathy cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. Well, he said, closing his briefcase with two decisive clicks that echoed like gunshots. That concludes the reading. The necessary documents will be filed with the probate court by the end of the week. The spell was broken. The room exhaled. The relatives began to shift, to murmur, their social obligations fulfilled. The show was over. Now came the aftermath. The awkward condolences they would have to offer me. I didn't want their pity. It felt like acid. I looked at the velvet box on the table, then at my brother's placid face, and then at my father's rigid back. This wasn't just an injustice. It was a betrayal. It was a carefully constructed lie, one they had all been living, and I had been too blind or too hopeful to see it. As soon as the front door clicked shut behind Mr. Abernathy, the fragile dam of decorum burst. The air, which had been thick with tension, was suddenly filled with the clinking of teacups and the rustle of fabric as people shifted, turning to each other in hushed, urgent pairs. The wake had officially begun, and my public humiliation was the main dish on the menu. The low hum of conversation started, a swarm of whispers that I could feel more than hear. It was a language I knew well, the coded dialect of family judgment, and every word was a tiny, stinging dart aimed in my direction. I felt utterly exposed, a specimen pinned to a board for all to examine. I tried to make myself small in the armchair, wishing the floral upholstery could swallow me whole. But there was no escape. Snippets of conversation drifted over, sharp and clear. "Well, it's not a surprise, is it?" I heard my Uncle Robert murmur to his wife. Eleanor was always practical. Daniel was the one who would carry on the name. My cousin Jennifer, who had always been jealous of my grades in school, added her own 2 cents in a stage whisper to her mother. She always knew Daniel needed the stability. Sarah's always been so independent. The word independent was wielded like a weapon, a synonym for unworthy or unattached. My entire life of being responsible was being reframed as a reason for my own disinheritance. Then, a shadow fell over me. It was Great Aunt Carol, her teacup rattling in its saucer as she leaned in, her perfume an aggressive cloud of lavender. "Now, Sarah," she began, her voice dripping with condescending sympathy, "don't you fret. Your mother knew what she was doing. She knew you were the strong one, the one who could make her own way." She patted my hand with fingers that felt like cold, dry twigs. "Daniel, well, he has more responsibilities. The house, the family legacy. It's a heavy burden. Your mother was just protecting him." Protecting him. From what? From having to share? From the terrible inconvenience of treating his sister as an equal? I finally forced myself to look at him. Daniel was no longer feigning somber duty. He stood near the fireplace, the new lord of the manor, accepting quiet, almost congratulatory handshakes from the men in the family. And then I saw it. It wasn't a full-blown smirk, nothing so crude. It was a flicker of a smile that he quickly suppressed, a gleam of pure, unadulterated triumph in his eyes before he veiled it again with a look of pensive responsibility. It was the exact same look he'd had at 16, the day he'd crashed my father's car and deftly managed to imply that I must have left the emergency brake off. It was the look of a man whose lifelong, unshakable belief in his own superiority had just been ratified by the highest possible authority. The question that had been a dull ache in the back of my mind now screamed through me, a silent, internal shriek. But why? I was her daughter, too. I was the one who sat with her for endless hours during her chemotherapy, reading aloud when her eyes were too tired. I was the one who managed her bills, who ran to the pharmacy in the middle of the night, who held the basin for her when she was sick. Daniel would swoop in for an hour on a Sunday afternoon, fill the room with his booming charm, and leave, his filial duty performed. My service was quiet, constant, and invisible, and it appeared my mother had seen it the same way. She had seen my strength not as a virtue to be rewarded, but as a resource to be exploited. An excuse to give everything to the son she deemed too weak or too important to carry his own weight. The betrayal was so profound, so absolute, it left me breathless. This wasn't a will. It was a final, devastating judgment on my entire life. The last of the relatives had finally trickled out, their hushed condolences and pitying glances leaving a greasy film on the air. The house fell into a silence that was louder than the earlier chatter, a heavy, suffocating quiet that pressed in from all sides. My father had retreated to his study, closing the door with a soft, final click. Daniel had made a show of taking a phone call on the veranda, his voice a low, confident murmur, the new king conducting his business. I was left alone in the living room, a ghost in a house that was no longer mine. I couldn't sit still. The armchair where I'd received my sentence felt like it was burning me. I drifted aimlessly, my feet carrying me through rooms that were suddenly alien, filled with objects that held no memory of me. I found myself upstairs, standing in the doorway of my mother's small office. It was the one room in the house that was more her than the perfect curated spaces downstairs. It smelled of old books, dried lavender, and the faint, acidic scent of the lemon tea she drank every afternoon. My gaze fell upon the old mahogany chest of drawers in the corner, a piece that had been in the family for generations. Its dark wood was scarred with a century of life. I ran my hand over its smooth, cool surface, a sudden, desperate need to touch something real, something that held a piece of the past that wasn't tainted by the day's events. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I was just moving, trying to outrun the storm in my head. On autopilot, I pulled open the second drawer. It slid out with a familiar, woody groan. It was where she kept old stationery, photo negatives, and sentimental clutter. A lifetime of odds and ends. My fingers sifted through bundles of old letters tied with faded ribbon and stacks of postcards from vacations taken long before I was born. And then I felt it. Tucked beneath a stack of blank, cream-colored note cards was a large, stiff manila envelope. It was thicker than a normal letter. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled it out. In my mother's elegant, looping script was a single word. Sarah. Just my name. My heart began to hammer against my ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. I turned the envelope over in my hands. It was the kind a lawyer would use, heavy and official. But unlike the one Mr. Abernathy had read from, this one wasn't sealed. The little metal clasp at the back was flat and undone, and the strip of gum on the flap was dry and untouched. A tremor went through my hands. This was something different. Something private. For a dizzying moment, a wild, foolish hope surged through me. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the explanation. The letter. The real will. With fumbling fingers, I lifted the flap and tilted the envelope. A single, crisp file folder slid out into my palm. It was light. Too light. I opened it. It was completely, utterly empty. The silence of the room rushed back in, deafening. I stared at the blank, empty folder, my mind struggling to process the void. It made no sense. Why would my mother write my name on a large, important-looking envelope, hide it in her private drawer, and then put an empty folder inside? It was a gesture without a conclusion, a sentence without an end. At first, it just felt like another one of life's cruel, nonsensical jokes. But as I stood there, the empty folder in my hand, the memory of her voice came back to me, clear as a bell. I've taken care of everything, Sarah. A soft place to land. The words echoed in the hollow space of the folder. This wasn't just an empty envelope. It was a container for something that was now gone. The cold knot of suspicion that had been forming in my gut tightened into something sharp and painful. This wasn't an absence. It was an erasure. And the first real question, not of emotion, but of fact, began to bloom in the wreckage of my grief. What was supposed to be in here? I found him on the veranda, leaning against the railing and looking out over the darkening lawn. The empty manila envelope felt stiff and incriminating in my hand. For a moment, I just watched him, the perfect silhouette of the favored son, inheriting his kingdom at dusk. The anger that had been simmering inside me all afternoon had cooled into something hard and sharp, a tool I could finally wield. I walked out, the French door clicking softly behind me, and he turned, a practiced, mournful smile already forming on his lips. "Sarah, are you doing okay?" he asked, his voice a perfect blend of concern and condescension. It was the tone he had always used when I was upset, the one that instantly made me feel like a child having a tantrum. "I have a question for you, Daniel," I said, my voice steadier than I expected. I held up the envelope. "I found this in Mom's desk. It has my name on it. Inside was this empty folder. Do you know what was supposed to be in it?" He looked at the envelope, and for a split second, a flicker of genuine surprise, or maybe alarm, crossed his face, before he masked it with a dismissive little laugh. "Sarah, what are you talking about? You're going through her things already? It's probably nothing, just some old papers she meant to throw away. You're getting yourself worked up." He waved a hand as if to brush away my concern, as if it were a troublesome gnat. "Don't patronize me," I snapped, the control I was holding onto beginning to fray. "She told me she had taken care of everything. She told me I would have a soft place to land. An empty envelope and a ring is not a soft place to land. It's a slap in the face. So I'll ask you again. What was in it?" The air between us grew cold and tight. He dropped the sympathetic act, his posture shifting, becoming more rigid, more defensive. He sighed, a long theatrical exhalation of a man burdened by an unreasonable woman. He was preparing a speech, one I could tell he had rehearsed in his own mind 100 times. "Look," he began, his voice taking on a tone of pained reason. "Let's be realistic. Mom knew what she was doing. She was a smart woman." He paused, as if for effect. "She knew you were strong. You've always been the strong one, Sarah. You've got a great career. You're self-sufficient. You can take care of yourself. I have more responsibilities. This house, Dad, the family name. It's a lot of pressure." She knew I needed the support. His words were a masterclass in manipulation, a twisted logic that used my own competence as a weapon against me. The argument was so outrageous, so deeply insulting, that it left me momentarily speechless. "So I get nothing because I'm responsible?" I finally managed to say, my voice trembling with a fresh wave of fury. "And you get everything because you're... what? Weak?" A flash of anger in his eyes. I'd hit a nerve. "That's not what I'm saying," he shot back, his voice rising. "I'm saying Mom was a pragmatist. She knew the estate was better kept whole with me to manage it. She knew you wouldn't need it. She did it because she knew you could handle it, and she worried that I couldn't." The nasmeska, the mockery, was there now, hiding just beneath the surface of his words. He was framing his greed as a testament to my strength, and his inheritance as a burden he was bravely shouldering for the good of the family. The conversation was over. He would never tell me the truth. But his defensiveness, his perfectly constructed self-serving argument, was more damning than any confession. He wasn't just a beneficiary of this injustice, he was its architect. The confrontation with Daniel left a bitter, metallic taste in my mouth. His words, a poisonous cocktail of condescension and self-serving logic, had extinguished the last ember of hope that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. This was deliberate. 2 days later, on a cold and drizzly Tuesday morning, I pushed open the heavy oak door to Mr. Abernathy's law office. The air inside smelled of old leather and dust, a place where traditions were preserved like ancient insects in amber. His secretary, a woman who seemed to have been there since the 1970s, showed me into his office with a look of bored pity. The room was dark, paneled in mahogany, and lined with books that looked like they hadn't been opened in a century. It was a room built to intimidate. Mr. Abernathy rose from his massive leather chair, gesturing for me to sit. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Ms. Covington, I must admit I was surprised to hear from you so soon." His tone was professionally courteous but held an undercurrent of caution. He was a man who disliked loose ends, and I was a very loose end. I got straight to the point. "Mr. Abernathy, I have some questions about my mother's will." He steepled his fingers, his face a neutral mask. "The document is quite clear. As the executor, my job is simply to carry out your mother's stated wishes. The probate process will proceed accordingly. It's all very straightforward." He was building a wall of legal jargon, and I knew I had to breach it quickly. "It's not straightforward to me," I said, leaning forward. I placed the empty manila envelope on the vast, polished expanse of his desk. It looked small and insignificant there, but it felt like the only weapon I had. "I found this in my mother's desk. It's addressed to me, in her handwriting. But it's empty. Just before she died, she told me she had taken care of me, that I wouldn't have to worry. This," I gestured to the envelope, then to the garnet ring on my finger. "This doesn't feel like taking care of me. It feels like a lie." He picked up the envelope and examined it, his expression unreadable. He looked at the front, the back, and then placed it back on the desk between us. He sighed, a soft, weary sound. "Sarah," he said, using my first name for the first time, a calculated move to create a sense of paternal authority. "Your mother was a meticulous woman, but she was very ill at the end. People get ideas. They start paperwork they don't finish. They change their minds. It's a tragic part of the process. I can't speculate on an empty folder. It would be unprofessional. All I can act upon is the final, signed, and witnessed document that was read to you and your family. That is the only thing that has any legal standing." He was closing the door gently but firmly. He was dismissing me as a hysterical, grieving daughter, clinging to phantom promises. "She wasn't confused that day," I insisted, my voice gaining an edge of desperation. "She was perfectly lucid. She looked me right in the eye. Her words meant something." I was pleading now, and I hated myself for it, but I couldn't stop. The image of her frail hand in mine was too vivid. Mr. Abernathy shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the leather groaning in protest. He clearly wanted this conversation to be over. "Ms. Covington, what you believe she meant and what the legal document states are two different things. My duty is to the document." He paused, looking down at his desk. "There was another version of the will at one point, a draft. But this is the one she chose to sign. That is the end of the matter." The room went silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to grow impossibly loud. "Another version?" I whispered, the words catching in my throat. His eyes snapped up to meet mine, and I saw a flash of regret, of professional annoyance at his own slip of the tongue. He had said too much. He immediately went cold, the brief moment of paternal condescension gone, replaced by the impenetrable shield of the lawyer. "That is privileged information. The contents of unexecuted drafts are irrelevant. This meeting is over." He stood up, a clear dismissal. I stood as well, my legs feeling unsteady. I hadn't gotten a confession or an explanation, but I had gotten something far more important, a confirmation, a beginning. My mother hadn't lied to me. The question was no longer if. She had planned to provide for me, but who had stopped her? Mr. Abernathy's accidental admission had lit a fire in the cold, dead space of my grief. Another version. The words were a key, and I was now certain there was a lock somewhere that it would fit. I drove back to the house on Sycamore Lane that afternoon, using the key I still had, my heart thudding with a mixture of righteous fury and a child's fear of being caught. The house was empty. Daniel was out, likely finalizing arrangements to officially take possession of his kingdom. The silence that greeted me was different now. It wasn't the sad, hollow quiet of mourning. It was a watchful, tense silence, as if the very walls knew I was there on a covert mission, a spy in the home where I grew up. I started in my mother's office, the place I'd found the empty envelope. I was more methodical this time, a detective searching for a clue that had been missed. I pulled every book from the shelves, shaking them gently, hoping a stray piece of paper might fall out. I ran my hands along the backs of drawers, searching for anything taped out of sight. The house seemed to resist me at every turn. A floorboard creaked upstairs, and I froze, my blood turning to ice, convinced it was Daniel returning early. The furnace kicked on in the basement with a sudden, violent whoosh that made me jump. Every familiar sound was now menacing, a potential alarm signaling my intrusion. Realization dawned on me slowly. My mother was a deeply private person, but she was also a creature of habit. If she had hidden something so important, so explosive, she wouldn't have put it in a place of business like her office or the family filing cabinet in the study. She would have kept it somewhere close, somewhere that belonged only to her. Her bedroom. The thought sent a fresh wave of guilt through me. Entering that room without her in it felt like the ultimate trespass. It had been preserved exactly as she left it, the silver-backed brush and comb set arranged just so on her vanity, a book lying face down on her nightstand, its page marked. I moved through the room with a reverence that felt at odds with my purpose. I checked under the mattress, behind the heavy velvet curtains. I gently opened the drawers of her nightstand, finding only reading glasses, hand lotion, and a rosary. I slid open her lingerie drawer, the scent of lavender sachets rising up, and my hands faltered. Sifting through these intimate, personal items felt like a profound violation, a betrayal of her memory. For a moment, I almost gave up. What was I doing? I was a thief, rummaging through my dead mother's belongings, fueled by a lawyer's slip of the tongue and a desperate hope. But the image of Daniel's triumphant smirk propelled me forward. I moved to her walk-in closet. A wave of her scent, the familiar mix of her perfume and cedar, washed over me, and for a heart-stopping moment, it felt like she was standing right behind me. My eyes scanned the shelves, moving past shoe boxes and stacks of sweaters. Then I saw it. On the highest shelf, tucked behind a stack of old photo albums and a vintage hat box she never used, was something that didn't belong. It wasn't a safe or a document box. It was a simple, dark cherry wood box, about the size of a shoebox, with no markings on it. It was hidden in plain sight by its own modesty. My breath hitched. With trembling hands, I reached for the small stepladder kept in the corner and climbed up. The box was heavier than it looked, solid and substantial. I brought it down and sat on the carpet, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. This was it. I could feel it. The answer was inside this box. I ran my fingers over the smooth, cool wood, a lifetime of unspoken words seemingly contained within it. I braced myself and tried to lift the lid. It wouldn't budge. My fingers scrabbled at the seam, but it was held fast. A small, tarnished brass lock was embedded in the front, its keyhole a tiny, dark frown. It was locked. The house had given up one of its secrets, only to present me with another, smaller, harder one. I had found the container. Now I had to find the key. The locked box sat on my mother's bedroom floor, a silent, wooden sphinx. It was both a promise and a taunt. My mind raced, frantically sifting through years of memories, searching for the image of a key. Where would she keep something so important? My mother was a woman of systems, of designated places for everything. A key to her innermost secrets wouldn't be tossed carelessly in a dish. It would be protected. It would be hidden somewhere that meant something to her. Her jewelry box. The thought was a lightning strike. The large, ornate silver box on her vanity was her most prized possession, a gift from my father on their 10th anniversary. I hadn't dared to touch it earlier, but now I moved with a feverish certainty. I lifted the heavy, engraved lid. The top tray was filled with the jewelry she wore regularly: her pearl necklace, a collection of gold bangles, the diamond earrings she reserved for special occasions. It wasn't there. My fingers trembled as I lifted the tray out, revealing the velvet-lined compartments below. This was her archive of sentiment: my grandfather's cufflinks, a locket with a baby picture of Daniel, my first lost tooth wrapped in tissue paper. And there, in a small square compartment, was a tiny, tarnished brass key, no bigger than my thumbnail, tied with a thin, faded blue ribbon. It was intricate and old-fashioned, the kind of key you see in fairy tales. I snatched it up, my breath catching in my throat, and scrambled back to the wooden box on the floor. The key slid into the lock with a soft, metallic whisper. It turned with a satisfying, solid click. For a moment, I just knelt there, my hand resting on the lid, suddenly terrified of what I was about to find. The truth I had been so desperately seeking was inches away, and I wasn't sure I was ready for it. I took a deep, shuddering breath and lifted the lid. The box was not filled with legal documents or financial statements. It was filled with letters, dozens of them, all in my mother's familiar, elegant script, bundled together with a silk ribbon. They were on her personal stationery, the thick, cream-colored paper she used for important correspondence. And on the top of the first envelope, in handwriting that was slightly shaky, was my name, Sarah. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely untie the ribbon. I pulled out the first letter, its date scrawled in the top corner, almost a year ago, just after her diagnosis. "My dearest Sarah," it began, "I am writing this because I am a coward. There are things a mother should be able to say to her daughter, face to face, and I have failed you in this, as I have in so many other ways. I see you, Sarah. Please, you must believe that. I see how you carry the weight of this family, how you have always been the one to smooth things over, to fix what is broken, to ask for nothing. I see your strength, and I have leaned on it, taken it for granted, and used it as an excuse." I had to stop reading, my vision blurred by a sudden hot rush of tears. I unfolded the next letter, and the next. They were a secret diary of her guilt, a chronicle of my life as seen through her eyes. One letter, dated after my college graduation, spoke of her pride and her shame. "Daniel brought home a trophy, and we threw him a party. You brought home a diploma with the highest honors, and I told you it was lovely, and asked if you'd pick up the cake for his celebration. I saw the hurt in your eyes that day. I saw it, and I did nothing, because keeping the peace, maintaining the cheerful, perfect facade of our family, felt more important than your heart. I chose the image of the family over the reality of my daughter. It is my life's greatest regret." The final letter was dated just 6 weeks ago, around the time she had told me I would have a soft place to land. It was the confession I had been searching for. "I had Abernathy draw up a new will," she wrote, her handwriting growing weaker, the ink slightly smudged. "It divides everything equally. It is fair. It is what you deserve. It has been sitting in my desk for a month. Every day I tell myself I will sign it, that I will make it right. But then your father and Daniel come in, and they talk about the future of the house, of the Covington name, and I see the expectation in their eyes. I see how Daniel has built his identity around being the heir. I know how fragile his confidence truly is beneath all the bluster, and I cannot do it. I am too weak to bear the force of their disappointment, too tired to fight the battle that would follow. They will call you greedy. They will say you turned me against them. I am a coward, my daughter. I saw your sacrifice and your strength, but I was too afraid to destroy the lie of our perfect family to honor you. Forgive me. The empty envelope in her desk drawer. It was where the new will was supposed to have been. It had never been signed. She never made it official. I knelt on the floor of my mother's closet, surrounded by the ghosts of her good intentions, and the truth crashed over me not like a gentle wave, but like a collapsing building. The letters were spread around me like fallen leaves, a paper monument to my mother's weakness and my lifelong delusion. All the rage I had felt toward her, the sharp, righteous anger that had propelled me through the last few days, evaporated, leaving a hollow, aching void in its place. She hadn't been malicious. She hadn't intentionally erased me. In a way, the truth was so much worse. She had seen me. She had understood everything, and she had chosen to do nothing. Her cowardice was a more profound betrayal than any act of cruelty. A dry, racking sob tore its way out of my chest, a sound that seemed to come from a place I didn't know existed. The tears I had refused to shed at the funeral, at the reading of the will, now came in a hot, unstoppable flood. I wasn't crying for the loss of a house or a bank account. I was crying for the little girl with the perfect science fair project, for the college graduate whose honors were an afterthought, for the daughter whose quiet strength was a convenient excuse for her own neglect. I was grieving the mother I thought I had, and the one I now knew I'd never had. She had loved me in her own way, but she had loved the illusion of her perfect family more. Legally, nothing had changed. The signed will was the only thing that mattered in the eyes of the law. The house belonged to Daniel. The money belonged to Daniel. The letters were just words, a secret confession that had no legal weight. They were emotionally explosive but legally worthless. I could feel the crushing finality of that fact. The battle for the inheritance was over before it had even begun. I had lost. By every practical measure, I had been completely and utterly defeated. I sat there for what felt like hours, the dust motes dancing in the slivers of afternoon light, until the tears finally subsided, leaving behind a strange and unexpected calm. Something inside me had shifted. The desperate, frantic need to prove the injustice, to claim what was rightfully mine, had been replaced by a different kind of clarity. My mother's confession, as painful as it was, had given me something the money never could have. It was validation. It was the truth, written in her own hand. My entire life, I had been fighting for a seat at a table where I was never truly welcome, seeking approval from people who were incapable of giving it. I was so focused on their perception of me that I had never stopped to form my own. The letters were a mirror, and in them, I didn't just see my mother's weakness. I saw my own strength reflected back at me. The strength she had seen, admired, and ultimately exploited. I carefully gathered the letters, my movements slow and deliberate. I tied them back together with the silk ribbon and placed them in the box. This box, this collection of heartbreaking truths, was my real inheritance. The house was just wood and nails. The money was just paper. But this was the story of my life. It was the proof that I was not crazy, that the injustice I felt was real. I wouldn't fight for the money. That was their world, their game, played by their rules. I would fight for something far more valuable. I would fight for my own voice. I would take the story they had tried to bury and I would tell it. The quiet, invisible daughter was about to get very, very loud. The Sunday dinner was Daniel's idea, a transparently magnanimous gesture from the new patriarch. It was meant to be a performance of family unity, a public demonstration that we were all moving forward under his benevolent leadership. The dining room table was set with our mother's best china, and the air was thick with the rich scent of roast beef and my father's stony silence. My aunts, uncles, and a few cousins were there, the same cast of characters who had offered me their pitying whispers just a week ago. They were all playing their parts, their conversation a carefully constructed veneer of normalcy, all of them studiously avoiding the one topic that pulsed beneath the surface. I sat in my usual chair, a specter at the feast, the box of letters a heavy, solid weight in the bag at my feet. For most of the meal I was silent, moving food around my plate. I watched them all, listening to the hollow clinking of silverware and the empty chatter about weather and local politics. I felt a strange, cold clarity, the calm of a surgeon about to make the first necessary incision. Daniel, at the head of the table, was in his element. He carved the roast with a flourish. He refilled wine glasses. He told a charming, self-deprecating story about a recent business deal. He was performing the role he had been born to play, and the family was his captive, appreciative audience. My father watched him with a flicker of pride in his otherwise vacant eyes. The moment came after the main course, just as dessert was being served. Daniel raised his glass, a self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. "I'd like to propose a toast," he said, his voice resonating with false sincerity. "To Mom. She wouldn't have wanted us to mourn for long. She would have wanted us to be here, together, as a family. To honor her legacy by staying strong and united." A murmur of agreement went around the table. As they raised their glasses, I gently set my own down, the soft click of glass on wood cutting through the moment. "I think there's another legacy we should talk about," I said, my voice quiet but carrying in the sudden lull. All eyes turned to me. I reached into my bag and pulled out the small bundle of letters tied with their silk ribbon. Daniel's smile faltered, a flicker of confusion and annoyance in his eyes. "Sarah, what are you doing? This isn't the time or the place." I ignored him, my gaze sweeping across the faces of my relatives. As Daniel said, Mom would have wanted us to honor her, and I believe the best way to do that is with the truth. She left behind some things, some letters. I'd like to read you one. A tense, uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Before anyone could object, I untied the ribbon, selected the final, most damning letter, and began to read. My voice was clear and steady, devoid of the emotion that had ripped me apart just days before. "My dearest Sarah," I began, "I am writing this because I am a coward." I saw my Aunt Carol's teacup pause halfway to her lips. "I have failed you. I saw your strength, and I have leaned on it, taken it for granted, and used it as an excuse." I looked up and met my father's gaze. He looked away. I continued. "I had Abernathy draw up a new will. It divides everything equally. It is fair. It is what you deserve." A collective, sharp intake of breath went around the table. Daniel's face had gone rigid, the color draining from his cheeks. He looked like a statue. I saved the most devastating lines for last. "Every day I tell myself I will sign it, but I am too weak to bear the force of their disappointment," I read, my eyes locking onto my brother, then my father. "I was too afraid to destroy the lie of our perfect family to honor you." When I finished, the silence was absolute. It was a physical thing, a heavy, suffocating blanket that smothered all sound. No one moved. No one breathed. The cheerful, ordinary dining room had transformed into a tomb. All the polite fictions, the carefully maintained illusions, the entire narrative of the noble son and the self-sufficient daughter had been shattered by my mother's own words. Daniel was ashen, his knuckles white where he gripped the table. The relatives stared, their faces a mixture of shock and dawning, horrified comprehension. They were no longer looking at me with pity. They were looking at my brother and at my father, as if seeing them for the very first time. The truth had finally been served. The sound of Daniel's chair scraping violently against the hardwood floor was the first sound to break the spell. It was a raw, ugly noise that ripped through the funereal silence. He shot to his feet, his face a mottled mask of crimson and white, his chest heaving. The charming, benevolent host was gone, replaced by a cornered animal. His eyes, burning with a furious, panicked light, were fixed on me. For a moment, he seemed to be searching for words, his mouth opening and closing silently. When they finally came, they were not whispered, but spat. "How dare you?" he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "How dare you do this?" He took a step away from the table, his hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at his sides. He wasn't speaking to me anymore. He was performing for the stunned audience. You twist the ramblings of a sick, dying woman. You take her private words, her confusion, and you use them to stage this disgusting little piece of theater. He gestured wildly around the room, as if to indicate the trap I had set. You were always jealous, always lurking in the background, poisoning her mind, making her feel guilty. This is a lie, a pathetic, desperate attempt to steal what isn't yours. His voice cracked on the last word, the rage momentarily giving way to a raw, childish panic. My father sat frozen, his eyes fixed on his plate. A man turned to stone. He would not intervene. He would not choose a side. His silence was his final, pathetic abdication of fatherhood. Daniel, seeing no support from him and nothing but shocked condemnation on the faces of our relatives, completely lost control. With a guttural cry of frustration, he snatched his napkin from the table and threw it down. "I don't have to listen to this," he snarled, his gaze sweeping over everyone, daring them to challenge him. No one did. He turned on his heel and strode out of the dining room. A moment later, the front door slammed with a force that rattled the china in the cabinets, the sound echoing the final, violent collapse of our family's great lie. In the ringing silence that followed, a new dynamic began to form. The void Daniel left was filled with the weight of the truth I had just read. My Uncle Robert, who had always been Daniel's biggest cheerleader, slowly shook his head, looking down at the table in what seemed like shame. Then, my great-aunt Carol, the woman who had told me to be strong, for them, rose slowly from her chair. She walked around the table and stopped behind me. I braced myself for another lecture, another platitude. Instead, she placed a hand on my shoulder. Her touch wasn't cool or brief this time. It was warm and firm. "That took courage, Sarah," she said, her voice low and thick with an emotion I had never heard from her before. It sounded like respect. That one small gesture broke the spell. My cousin Jennifer, who had whispered about my independence, met my eyes from across the table and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Uncle Robert looked at me, his expression full of a new, sober understanding. They had seen the truth. They had seen Daniel's ugly, panicked greed, and my father's hollow inaction. They had seen, for the first time, the real structure of our family, stripped of all its pretty decorations. In that moment, I looked at the gleaming silverware, the expensive china, the heavy crystal glasses, the very house that surrounded us, the inheritance. And I felt nothing. It was just a collection of things. It had only ever been a symbol, a prize in a competition I was never meant to win. The real prize wasn't the house or the money. It was this. It was the look of respect on my aunt's face. It was the truth, finally dragged out into the light, raw and undeniable. It was the sound of a door slamming shut on a lifetime of being invisible. I had been fighting for their approval, for a place in their story. But my mother's letters and Daniel's rage had given me something better. They had given me my own story. The inheritance was just a thing, but my legacy, the one I was claiming for myself right now, was my own voice and my own strength. I had finally inherited myself. Epilogue. It has been 6 months since that last Sunday dinner. I live in a small apartment downtown now, on the 7th floor, with a window that looks out over the city instead of a perfectly manicured lawn. It's a space that is entirely my own, filled with secondhand books, mismatched furniture, and the quiet satisfaction of a life I am building for myself. Some mornings, when the sun streams in, I make a cup of tea and sit by that window, and I feel a sense of peace that is so profound, so complete. It feels like a physical presence in the room. It's a peace I never knew in that big, silent house on Sycamore Lane. A house that was always full of unspoken rules and invisible hierarchies. Daniel got the house, of course. The law was the law. I see him sometimes, when I'm driving through my old neighborhood. He keeps the lawn immaculate, just as our mother did. From the outside, it looks exactly the same, a perfect portrait of suburban stability. But I know what it is now. A museum of lies. A beautiful facade with hollow rooms. We haven't spoken since the night he slammed the door. There's nothing left to say. He won the property, the stocks, the bonds. He won the prize he had been groomed for his entire life, but he lost the one thing he always took for granted: a family to witness his reign. His kingdom is an empty one. My father and I still speak, in a manner of speaking. He calls every second Sunday, and we engage in a careful, stilted conversation about the weather, his health, and the price of gas. We never mention my mother. We never mention Daniel. We never mention the truth. He is a ghost rattling around in that house with my brother, a man who chose silence so many years ago that he no longer knows how to speak. The calls are a sad, hollow ritual, but I answer them. He is my father. But the wall between us is now made of solid stone. In contrast, my great-aunt Carol called me a month after that dinner. There was no pity in her voice. She simply asked me how I was doing, how I was settling into my new place. It was a simple, human question, and in it, I heard the beginning of a new kind of family, one built not on illusions, but on a difficult, acknowledged truth. The cherrywood box sits on a shelf in my own closet now. I don't need to read the letters anymore. Their words are etched into me, a part of my very bones, and on my finger, I still wear the garnet ring. For a while I thought of it as a symbol of my mother's weakness, the pathetic consolation prize she gave me in place of justice. But I've come to see it differently. She told me to wear it and remember the strength of the women in our family. I realize now that their strength wasn't just in their quiet endurance of pain and injustice. It was also a seed, a hidden wellspring of power, waiting for one of them to finally draw from it, not just to survive, but to fight back. I am not wearing it for the woman she was, but for the woman she was too afraid to be. I didn't get the house or the money. I didn't get the tangible proof of my mother's love that I once so desperately craved, but I received something far more valuable, something that could never have been written into a legal document. I was given the right to my own story. I was freed from a lifetime of seeking the approval of people who saw me as a supporting character in their own drama. The truth, the one written in my mother's own hand, is the only inheritance that matters. And this will, this final honest testament, I keep stored in a place far deeper and more secure than any bank vault. I keep it in myself.